Blake Stephenson.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask some questions about the importance of delivering infrastructure to build sustainable communities. How confident are you that the infrastructure that's required to support 1.5 million houses will be delivered? Maybe I can start with Mr. Stafford.
Okay, I think we probably need to split that infrastructure into. Hugh talked about flood risk resilience previously. We need to probably talk about energy generation, energy transmission as well. We probably need to be thinking about the big pieces of kit and national policy statements, which the government I think has committed to review within 12 months. So I'll probably split that infrastructure in its broader sense into issues of national significance, and then maybe the infrastructure that you might associate with an individual planning application, which is more of the bread and butter and day-to-day headaches that HBF members come across. And I would be really interested in Richard's thoughts on this, because the delivery of the infrastructure that both existing and new residents would want to see as part of any major development is fiendishly difficult to deliver. Be that dealing with county highways or Highways England on road upgrades, junction improvements, that kind of thing, whether it's dealing with Network Rail around new stations, whether it's dealing with school places, GP surgeries. The system is very, very fragmented to everybody's discredit, because it looks to the general population as though these things are not being planned for in a coherent manner, and to the unsophisticated eye, I think that's probably a fair assessment.
Sounds like you're not terribly confident, but perhaps Councillor Wright, you might have some observations.
If I could just briefly come back to the previous question. I thought it's disingenuous to suggest that monies achieved for planning applications was going to general funds, because, as Mr. Ellis pointed out, it's the most democratic situation we ever sort out. I'd like to invite you all to North West Even to see how we do get young planners. We actually grow our own, so we're obviously doing something to attract younger people. Am I confident the infrastructure will be delivered? Then the answer is no. It's as simple as that. There isn't anything really that's come forward in the revision of the MPPF to actually facilitate that. And we're talking from the already built environment again. We've already got a lack of infrastructure with regards to flood resilience and our utilities. Now, if we're looking to actually put a plan in place or suggest new housing coming forward, there's a disconnect between the local plan process and our utilities, for instance. So before we even talk about GP surgeries, schools and highways, the fact that we can have presentations from water companies that tell us what their business plan is, and we tell them that we've got a new local plan just about to come into force, and they still don't align because there is no duty to cooperate, which is what's desperately needed. So we can't even. So developers, in the main, had the right to connect. Sometimes there are mitigating situations put in place where the infrastructure might be requested on top of that, but you end up with an infrastructure system that's already overburdened, and then we're seeing the news that we've actually got water companies admitting to sewage discharges on systems that new houses are being allowed to connect to, because there is no requirement to put that infrastructure in place to start with. That's before we even get onto road infrastructure, GP infrastructure, all the sort of softer. So I'm talking about the really basic infrastructure. There is nothing that I've seen in the revision that will actually change that situation.
Ellis?
I wish I was more confident. I think that the way that we organise infrastructure provision and housing in this country is, on a European scale, fairly catastrophically poor. And the interesting thing is that there is a lack of a master developer role. And that's why the debate, the government's interest in development corporations and new towns is interesting, because without that master developer role on a scheme level, it's very difficult to generate the kind of coordination that you need. It is possible, but it will take a great deal of time as a nation to get back to having a national spatial plan, which basically sets out what goes where. And it's interesting to hear the talk about where most of this growth will take place. And the idea that it will follow the current economic trend into the southeast is interesting, because that reinforces a paradox that won't go away environmentally, which is that the southeast has environmental limits which we're now banging our head on. So in that sense, I think that I'm not but there's one other much bigger issue. And here I think, and it's much more difficult, and it's this. The expectation is that the private sector will be the biggest generator through development values of infrastructure at a scheme level through Section 106. And there are limited headroom values, even with land value capture, which I am a great supporter of. It is not a magic money tree. And the lessons of the new towns and the lessons of other major infrastructure successes in this country suggest that national government has to back investment. So an investment programme in social rent or an investment to modernise our national grid. If the expectation is that that will solely be driven by the private sector in this framework, I think that's extremely unlikely. What I'm really worried about is that a development is allowed to proceed before the necessary infrastructure is delivered, because infrastructure first is probably the most golden rule of good town and country planning there can be. And in that sense, I think, again, this is going to take time. But we do need master developers to build out at scale. And that is where development corporations could be transformational.
So given that there is so little confidence that the infrastructure is going to either be delivered upfront or that it indeed will follow, what do you all think are the biggest sort of environmental risks that we should be sort of alive to? So maybe I can start with Mr. Stafford again.
Like I said before, the MPPF is as I think Ant Breach said, is in around reversing the December 23 changes, and the Environment Act, the Habitats Regs, everything else is as is. So I'm not sure I would detect a net change, if you like, in the three legs of Alistair Scott's stool that he talked about before. I think it's the so in reversing those changes, I think that that's a positive thing, certainly from a HBF point of view. What I would hope that the new government can turn its attention to, having done so, is the functionality and the cross-departmental working and the sense of purpose, horizontal working, or whatever the Whitehall wonks would call it, to try to knit some of these disparate strands together in the spirit of that win-win letter that the two Secretaries of State sent to environmental NGOs in July. Thank
you, Mr. Stafford. Mr. Ellis?
As a one sentence answer, climate mitigation. We're going to lose places on the East Coast. All the professionals know that. We all know it from a flood risk point of view. The NPPF is staggeringly been blindsided by the climate crisis on adaptation. The money that we're going to need to defend ourselves has to be found, and that means a reassessment of investing in resilience is the best pound of infrastructure spend you will ever make for this country.
Yeah. And finally, Councillor Wright.
Yeah, I think I'll add to that as well. It was mentioned earlier about split responsibilities between MHCLG and DEFRA. I'd like to add the EA to that. Because that's where we've got huge issues, so we can have an area that's planned out, but we know now that flood mitigation is just not taking place. Yeah. This huge amount of investment we're being told all the time is needed, but it doesn't seem to be starting. For instance, in parts of Lincolnshire, there were breaches from Babette and Hank, and going into this winter, they've not been repaired. So we've already got existing issues before we even start to add to the built form. So the biggest threat, of a single threat, I think, environmentally, is flooding, but there are so many others.
In the interest of time, Chair, did you want to move on to other members?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we can certainly